Good morning and welcome to Community Church of Chesterland. We want to welcome all of our soon-to-be members. We want to welcome any visitors as well. I want to let everyone know that no matter where you are on life's journey, you are always welcome here at Community Church of Chesterland.
The Hill We Climb by Amanda Gorman. It's an amazing piece of work done by an amazing young woman. And it's amazing for so many different reasons. But for me, it not only encapsulated what we've been through as a nation, not only in our short-term history, but in our long-term history as well. But more importantly, it beautifully laid out what we might have to look forward to in the future if we are brave enough as a people to embrace what we're going to talk about today, which is the urgency of now, and to make that future happen. And even though it's a little long, it's about 6 minutes, Amanda Gorman's words of hope and wisdom are this week's moment of focus, and who better to share it than the poet herself. So Jeff, if we can roll the Hill We Climb.
Mr. President, Dr. Biden, Madam Vice President, Mr. Emhoff, Americans, and the world. When day comes, we ask ourselves, where can we find light in this never-ending shade? The loss we carry, a sea we must wade. We've braved the belly of the beast. We've learned that quiet isn't always peace, and the norms and notions of what just isn't always just is. And yet the dawn is hours before we knew it. Somehow we do it. Somehow we've weathered and witnessed a nation that isn't broken, but simply unfinished. We, the successors of a country and a time where a skinny Black girl descended from slaves and raised by a single mother can dream of becoming president, only to find herself reciting for one. And yes, we are far from polished, far from pristine, but that doesn't mean we are striving to form a union that is perfect. We are striving to forge our union with purpose, to compose a country committed to all cultures, colors, characters, and conditions of man. And so we lift our gaze not to what stands between us, but what stands before us. We close the divide because we know to put our future first, we must first put our differences aside. We lay down our arms so we can reach out our arms to one another. We seek harm to none and harmony for all. Let the globe, if nothing else, say this is true. That even as we grieved, we grew, that even as we hurt, we hoped, that even as we tired, we tried, that we'll forever be tied together, victorious, not because we will never again know defeat, but because we will never again sow division. Scripture tells us to envision that everyone shall sit under their own vine and fig tree, and no one shall make them afraid. If we're to live up to our own time, then victory won't lie in the blade, but in all the bridges we've made. That is the promised glade, the hill we climb, if only we dare it, because being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. We've seen a force that would shatter our nation rather than share it, would destroy our country if it meant delaying democracy. And this effort very nearly succeeded. But while democracy can be periodically delayed, it can never be permanently defeated. In this truth, in this faith we trust, for while we have our eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared it in its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So while once we asked, how could we possibly possibly prevail over catastrophe. Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. Our blunders become their burdens. But one thing is certain: if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one we were left. With every breath from my bronze pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limbed hills of the West. We will rise from the wind-swept Northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked South. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover in every known nook of our nation, in every corner called our country. Our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade of flame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it.
So what does it mean to become a member of a spiritual community, of a church? What does it mean to become a member of this spiritual community at Chesterland UCC? Well, the answer to that could be very, very different for everyone sitting here today. But as a member of Chesterland UCC, you sort of become like an owner of a shared business, right? I mean, you have, input and voting power. You have voting privileges with regard to church matters, almost like a co-op. Voting privileges that will be utilized today at our annual meeting. And as a self-sustaining organization, we ask that you also share your gifts of time and talent and money. And we've been spotlighting this for the last few weeks. Understanding, of course, that some are able to contribute a lot, some a little, and some are not always able to contribute at all due to difficult circumstances, or they simply choose not to, which is perfectly okay as well. These acts become the foundation of our communal life. And members, whether new or old, should assume this responsibility with a deepened sense of commitment. Membership is an expression of appreciation for the richness and blessing of this spiritually and physically communal life. And this morning, I am so incredibly happy to present 11 people, not all who could make it today, but 11 people who have made the decision to be recognized as a part of this community. And if that is you, please stand. Let's give them all a round of applause. Connie, would you grab that and just go ahead? We have a flower for you. And as I told you all last Sunday, membership is taking the leap of belonging. And because of that, we are on this journey of life together, and we seek to support you through this journey. And in turn, we hope that you all will support others just the same. So I said we're sort of almost like a co-op business here. Well, your job here at CCC is all of our jobs here, and that is to follow your conscience, listen to your heart, and plug into this community where you feel called or led. So we seek to create and be a safe space here of compassion and love to not just the wider community, but to those of us who attend here. And as a member, I hope that you as new members and established members as well, that you share this vision, but that to the best of your ability, you not just share this vision, but to the best of your ability, you live it out. Please ask questions. Challenge the status quo. Invite others to our events and gatherings. Vision and dream big and take up space as we journey together through this. So I enthusiastically welcome you all as new members. And one more time, let's welcome our new members.
Come thou fount of every blessing, tune my heart to sing your grace. Streams of mercy never ceasing, call for songs of endless praise. Teach me some melodious sonnet sung by flaming tongues above. Praise the mount I'm fixed upon it, mount of God's unfailing love.
Our scripture reading this morning is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, verses 14 to 20. And I'm reading this morning from the Inclusive Bible. After John's arrest, Jesus appeared in Galilee, proclaiming the good news of God. This is the time of fulfillment. The reign of God is at hand. Change your hearts and minds and believe this good news. And while walking by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus saw the brothers, Simon and Andrew, casting their nets into the sea, since they fished by trade. And Jesus said to them, "Follow me. I will make you fishers of humankind." And they immediately abandoned their nets and followed Jesus. And proceeding a little farther along, Jesus saw the brothers, James and John, bar Zebedee. They too were in their boat, putting their nets in order. And immediately Jesus called to them, and they left their father Zebedee standing in the boat with the hired help and went off in the company of Jesus.
So the Gospel of Mark is an interesting inclusion within the New Testament canon. I think I say that about every book I talk about, because for various reasons, there are always very interesting reasons that books might have been included within the canon, or reasons maybe they shouldn't have been included with the canon, and they still were for some reason. Theology nerd, sorry. But Mark is maybe the shortest of the four canonical gospels that are included in the New Testament. It was the first gospel written, and it was finished around 70 CE, about 40 years after the death of the historical Jesus, and it heavily influenced Matthew and Luke as the direct source for many of their stories about Jesus. In some cases, just if you were in our New Testament study before we took a sabbatical, you would discover that within Matthew and Luke, sometimes there are direct copies of Mark, like literally word for word passages. So the Gospel of Mark has quite a bit of historical and developmental importance to it with regard to the development of the New Testament. And in addition, one of the more interesting things about Mark is the narrative choice by the author, who most likely was not named Mark, but we'll just say that for convenience sake, but to make the messianic mission of Jesus a secret to those around him within the narrative. Because in the first half of the Gospel of Mark, the only people who realize Jesus is the Messiah are the author and us, the reader. For example, right before our passage for today, God declares Jesus as chosen at his baptism. Chosen for what? I'm not sure yet, but that Jesus is chosen at his baptism. But the implication, when you read it, is that it was told directly to Jesus within his head rather than to the gathered crowd, which is presented differently in the Gospel of Matthew, where the implication is that this declaration from God was a public one. that the crowd also heard. And so in Mark, the identity of Jesus is obscured from everyone. And it seems that Jesus wants it that way. Within the narrative, even demons recognize Jesus, and we'll come back to this in a second, but he orders those demons not to make him known. Even his own family thinks that he's gone crazy. And you can read about that in chapter 3, family drama and the Jesus family. And his own townspeople take offense that he's teaching within the synagogue. So not exactly painting a picture of the Son of God, right? Now, scholars call this top secret approach that Jesus is using, they call it the messianic secret. And there are several explanations that deal with this interesting narrative choice. One of them having to do with the theory that the historical Jesus, the Jesus that really existed within history, never claimed messianic status. And this might have been the author's way of conveying both the historical as well as the mythic Jesus at the same time. But for our purposes here, a narratological explanation, or to put it more simply, an in-story explanation, is that Jesus wanted to keep his identity secret because he didn't want people to get the wrong idea about what kind of Messiah that he was. I often ask you during my messages to keep in mind that first century Palestine was occupied by Rome, violently, forcefully occupied by Rome. And that's important again here, because it's safe to say that there were a lot of the Jewish people who were looking for a warrior Messiah, a new David, to deliver them by force from oppression. Of course, both the authors, or the author of Mark, and we as the reader know that this is not what Jesus represents. We know that he is some kind of Messiah, but he's not one who will use force or violence to get their way. But this would not have always been apparent to those around him living under the oppressive boot of Rome. These would have been a desperate people, desperate for freedom. But most interesting within the narrative is that the disciples don't even get it for the longest time. We're constantly told through the first half of the narrative that despite everything that they were witnessing, the disciples didn't understand. In Mark is where we get the line that just cracks me up from Jesus when he's explaining something to them, and they respond kind of weird, and he just goes, "Are you guys so dull? I mean, it's just, are you guys idiots? Why do you not get this, right?" And some would argue that this was also intentional on the part of Jesus. But it's pretty astounding. I mean, while I am talking narratively here, that doesn't mean that there wasn't something evident within the historical Jesus that suggested that he was a very different kind of cat. Without declaring any kind of divine heritage, without performing any miracles, we read in today's passage that people literally abandoned the work they were doing. They dropped their fishing nets and followed this guy. So even though they might not get it, there was something. It's pretty astounding to think about that. I mean, his allure, his presence, his words, his charisma maybe, something so powerful, so urgent, that people who couldn't afford to drop everything, remember, this is a community of poverty. Most people who lived in Judea at this time lived in poverty. So these were not people who could afford to just walk away from their work, to drop everything. But they did, and they dropped everything to take on his cause without even really knowing the full story yet. The late theologian and Episcopal Bishop John Shelby Spong writes in his book, and it's a great book. I highly recommend you check. I'm not sure if it's on the table out there or not, but it's called "Why Christianity Must Change or Die." And I'll get out of your way here so you can see the quote. I believe that Jesus was a God presence, Spong writes, a powerful experience of the reality of that ground of being undergirding us all at the very depths of life. That is why the earliest Christians interpreted this Christ experience in the language of theism. That was the only language in which they knew how to speak of God. All of this was but the interpretive framework in which the God experience in Jesus of Nazareth came to be understood. It's a great quote, great book, highly recommend it. But back to the story. So these first century blue-collar Jewish workers experienced something in the figure of the historical Jesus that was so compelling that it caused them to give up the security and normalcy of their working class jobs, to leave their families, and to join Jesus in a very different kind of work and life. I was part of a clergy Zoom retreat the past 2.5 days. And one of the topics that we talked about was how the role of pastor, the role of clergy has to change. It has to evolve. It has to, in this time and space that we're living in, where churches are closing their doors daily, where people are literally fleeing from church, the old ways of doing things are not working. And I'm not talking about growing a soul patch and trying to be hip. I'm talking about fundamentally how churches are, how clergy are, has to evolve. It has to change. And you would be surprised at the number of clergy in this group that said, I agree, but I can't because I'm going to get fired or I'm going to lose my pension. And it's understandable. It's completely understandable. I am not judging that. But then you look at the disciples who just encountered something so powerful in this man that they dropped their nets and immediately followed without concern for those long-term issues like finances. Right off the bat in Mark, Jesus is presented as a disruptor of normalcy. But he wasn't just seeking to disrupt individual lives. He was looking to upset the entire apple cart. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's jump ahead to chapter 5 a little bit. A few chapters after our reading for today, we are confronted with the story of the demon-possessed man in Mark chapter 5. Maybe you know this one. Jesus and his crew show up in a seaside town where they are immediately confronted by a demon-possessed man who is covered in shackles and chains, and he is living in misery. Jesus confronts the demon by asking its name, and the demon responds, anyone know? Legion, for we are many. Jesus then commands the demon to enter into a herd of pigs, and the pigs then stampede into the sea where they drown. Now, as a result, the demon-possessed man is renewed. He's healed. But the townspeople, then they beg Jesus to leave their community, which seems like an odd thing to do if one of your neighbors has just been healed from violent demon possession, which, according to the story, affected the whole community. Well, we can accept this story at face value if we choose to. Guy's possessed, Jesus comes along, drowns some pigs, and Guy is now good to go. Or we could put on our critical, historical, and literary thinking caps and remember that so much of what we read within Scripture is symbolic and metaphorical, and these stories should be read through the lens of what was happening then. And I don't think it was demon possession. Let's do that. Let's take a look at this story and ask a few questions. First, who was it again that was occupying the Jewish people at this time? Romans, good. Okay, what did the Romans call their units of military that get assigned to different regions? A legion. And this is hint number one that there might be something more going on in this story than demon possession. And a legion consisted of several thousand soldiers. And interestingly, Mark states that there were several thousand pigs nearby. Perhaps another hint. So here's a story where Jesus encounters someone being possessed or occupied by an unwanted force named Legion. In addition, this person is covered in chains and shackles. Now, from a symbolic standpoint, who might the demon-possessed man symbolically represent within this story? The Jewish people, or Judea, the occupied people, and their land. And some of the shackles and chains on the demon-possessed man were older and broken, perhaps also symbolizing the past incidents of enslavement that the Jewish people had to endure, say, at the hands of Babylon. So we have symbolically a battered and shackled individual, possibly representing the Jewish people. We have demons representing the legion of Rome who are oppressing those people. And what does Jesus do to the legion? Sends them into pigs and they go into the ocean. Thousands of pigs, and you can insert your own joke there, but they run into the ocean where they drown. Mike, did you have a question?
One of the interesting things that occurred to me a couple of years ago at Labyrinth is that those pigs were not being raised for the Jews,
right,
obviously.
Right, because they didn't eat it.
To feed Roman soldiers.
Excellent connection, excellent connection. So, I mean, the Jewish people don't eat cloven, hooved creatures. Yeah. And so, yes, Mike is absolutely right. So these would have been much in the same way that Nazis overtook the cattle of the various different regions to feed their army. Romans did the same thing. Why pay for our food when we can have these people raise the food for us and we can eat it? So you can see the connections here. Now, in all probability, the historical Jesus was more than likely speaking out against the occupation of his people by Rome when he and his disciples traveled to these towns. That's probably what got him attention and ultimately what got him killed. And those who later wrote of his exploits, at least in Mark's case, they often had to write in metaphors and symbols in order to avoid the wrath of any Romans who might find these writings. The biggest example of this is the book of Revelation, which is not the end times thing that people think it is, but it's basically, it's encoded poetry talking about the dangers of empire and Roman rule. And so we can see in this story of the demon-possessed man how the presence of Jesus shakes up the status quo when he enters into communities. Why else would the townspeople beg him to leave after freeing the demon-possessed man? If this story was just about demon possession and Jesus having control over demons, then demanding Jesus to leave after he does that doesn't make much sense. But if he were actually speaking out against Roman occupation, their fear of reprisals from the real legion might have made total sense for them to beg Jesus to leave. Now, this is a theory, and there are other theories. But the point of this exegesis of a demon-possessed man is to show that Jesus had a knack for shaking things up. In our scripture text for today, the routine of everyday life for these fishermen is radically transformed as they abandon their nets, abandon their livelihoods for the sake of joining in an alternative way of life where justice and love are the guiding factors. The disciples are called away, not just from fishing. They're called away from their life as they knew it. They are called to trade their known existence for one that was unknown, a different way of living altogether. And if you've had any life transitions where you don't know what's happening next, that's a scary feeling. It can also be a very exciting feeling, but it is also an anxious feeling when you don't know what your new life is going to entail, what that new step that you're taking will result in. And for the disciples, this included relational shifts. As we see in the text with James and John, who leave their father, the implication is their father's business. And they leave their father. And economic changes because they gave up their livelihood to answer this call. And I think that's a key component in our text today. Jesus didn't show up glowing in heavenly power. He wasn't speaking in some deep, booming, supernatural voice. The disciples were not asked to make a spiritual change in their lives or even to acknowledge Jesus as God, because when Mark was written, the church hadn't even decided that Jesus was God yet. The implication is that the Jesus that the disciples encountered here was simply challenging them to act, to urgently act, to walk away from their nets immediately, to step away from what was entangling them, as our nets often do, and to embark with Jesus on a journey that would have a tangible effect on not only people's lives, but the lives of their land and their families and their friends, the system. The Gospel of Mark presents to us a very earthy and organic Jesus, and I doubt that's a mistake. Because I've said this before, change and transformation are not just spiritual, they're not just personal or private acts. Change and transformation are social, and they're communal practices that all must engage with in the flesh. Because as Amanda Gorman makes so clear in her poem, we never belong only to ourselves. We can think that we're this independent, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, self-made individual. But the truth is that we are a part of a larger communal organism, and we cannot become whole and be reconciled while continuing to knowingly withhold resources to our neighbors, or withhold love from those in our midst, or to withhold justice from those most oppressed. These are the nets that entangle us and prevent us from responding to the divine spark within each of us, to the call for compassion and mercy and justice. These nets prevent us from responding urgently. It is simply impossible to fully present to the divine spirit, to be present to the divine spirit, to the impact of our actions, and to loving our neighbors while also refusing to urgently change the behaviors that are harming our friends and our neighbors and our community. Whether we are harming them through our direct action or simply through inaction. We can try. We can send our thoughts and prayers. We can pay lip service to reform or abolition, but without action, it's just toxicity. It's hollow sentiment. It's propping up the systems of oppression that have left so many people in chains, in shackles, and occupied. And I think that is what those first disciples saw in the historical Jesus. Living within a society under Roman rule where resources were diverted to the rich and where poverty was endemic, sound familiar? Mark paints a picture of a Jesus who represented and called for urgent change. We just recently celebrated Dr. King's birthday, and in probably his most famous speech ever, his I Have a Dream speech, he said this: "We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. This is no time for apathy or complacency. This is a time for vigorous and positive action." In today's text, the disciples meet Jesus for the first time, and they respond with the urgency of now. Their apathy and their complacency are just as quickly as their nets. And not just that first meeting. There is such an urgency to this man that they choose to live in community with him every day through both the mundane, everyday type stuff, as well as the extraordinary events that they witness. Similarly, in our communities, we meet the presence of the divine spirit again and again and again within the same people in different ways every day. And each time we experience the divine spark in our neighbors, we are being confronted with the urgency of love and compassion and justice. When we experience the divine presence, we are experiencing a disruptor of normalcy and an exorcism of the status quo. Man, does our status quo need exorcised? 3 days into the new year, Keenan Anderson, a Black teacher, was excessively tasered and murdered by police officers from the LAPD. 1 week into the new year, Tyree Nichols, a 29-year-old Black artist, beaten to death by Memphis police. 2 more Black lives ended at the hands of the police system for what? And we're almost done with January. January, the first month of the year. We're almost done, and there have already been over 40 mass shootings within the United States. And as tempting as it can now be to get back to normal after all that we've been through over the last several years, friends, our normal is unacceptable. When another Black life is snuffed out, when school children are murdered in their own classrooms, people love to get on social media and say, this isn't us, this isn't America, but it is. It always has been. It's always been our normal. And that normal is staring us in the face every day, daring us to take action. And as tempting as it can be to ignore that challenge, the divine spark within us calls out, follow me. As anxiety-inducing as it can be to take a public stand against white supremacy and homophobia and poverty and gun violence, the divine spark within us calls out, follow me. And as difficult as it can be to extract ourselves from the tangled nets of everyday injustice and oppression, the divine spark calls out, follow me. Follow compassion. Follow love. Follow justice. And as Amanda Gorman so eloquently wrote, we will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be. We will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and our inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. But one thing is certain: if we merge mercy with might and might with right, then love becomes our legacy and change our children's birthright. May it be so.
Abide with me, fast falls the evening, eventide, the shadows deepen. Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless abide with me. I need your presence every passing hour. I need your grace to foil the tempter's power. Give me your love, my guide, and stay to be. Through cloud and sunshine, abide with me.
All right, so this is the time in our gathering where we extend the invitation to you to take part in the life of the church through the act of giving. If you feel so led as to share your resources with Chesterland UCC, you can do that online through the QR code that's found in your bulletin. You can drop it in the plate at the doors there on your way out, or you can even mail it in if that's more convenient for you. And so with that, through our ordinary practices, we live God's dream into being. One simple choice at a time: to imagine, to share, to mend, to be held accountable, to learn. In gratitude for the grace, freedom, let us bring together our offerings before God. And so would you please all join me in prayer or meditation? God of compassion, we bring together our offerings with both sorrow and joy. Even as we hold tight to the hope of what could be, we do not turn from the grief and anger over the struggles of this day. As we dream of futures alive with justice, may we be faithful to the present reality and the fierce urgency of now. Faithful with our resources, faithful to truth, faithful in love and care for our neighbor. May this be so. Amen. And now we're entering into our time of prayer, prayer requests, celebrations. If you are visiting with us today, what we do is if someone has something that they'd like to offer up in prayer or even celebration, that's brought up. And then we all say together, everyone help me here. The divine spirit hears our prayers. So any prayer requests and or celebrations here live first?
I would like us to all pray for the Tyree Nichols family and the community, and for our country beginning to heal from all the systemic problems that we have.
Yeah. And the difficulty in healing right now is that so many people don't see that there's a problem. So how can you heal, right, until the problem is identified and then dealt with? Our country has a very unique knack of trying to pretend we don't have any problems. And that's one of the reasons they never heal, is because we deny them for so long, right?
There was also a shooting in Jerusalem at a synagogue yesterday on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So it's another time for us to remember the rise in anti-Semitism that perpetuates.
Yeah.
For the new 11 members who've joined us in celebration and becoming family, even though they were before, but to make it official.
For all of our new members, whether they're here in person, whether they're on Zoom, or whether they could not make it this morning, we are so grateful for all of them, and also just grateful for everyone who has been members and continues to come to Chesterland UCC. It's all awesome. So the divine spirit hears our prayers.
Judge William O'Neill was one of the presenters at our first Pride Day, and he's in the hospital recovering from heart surgery.
Oh,
and he's a wonderful man, and help us lift his spirit in prayer.
and you said Judge O'Neill?
Judge Bill O'Neill.
Judge Bill O'Neill for healing, and that he gets through this, and as for his family and friends as well around him. The divine spirit hears our prayers.
I just want to say, I feel such hope and community and love, very humble for all the things that we do have here today. And just basic gratitude and appreciation.
Great. Thank you, Jenny. Absolutely. Absolutely. For everything that Jenny said, and I think that we all concur, the divine spirit hears our prayers.
Thankful for the message and the understanding of Jesus's time.
I appreciate that, Catherine. Thank you.
Prayers for those who live every day fearing the police and or those who have been victimized by them.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, we will talk more about this in future messages as we have in past messages. But the importance of white people standing as allies and in some cases, walls of protection around people of color. Not that people of color cannot take care of themselves. That is not the implication. But it's that until white people understand what is happening in the culture with regard to people of color, particularly in relationship with law enforcement, these things will continue to happen. So for that issue, the divine spirit hears our prayers. Also, I just want to throw up real quick, as we have our annual congregational meeting after this, I just put out, prayer for leadership, prayer for congregational involvement in the life of the church, right? I've said it before, UCC is such a interesting denomination in the sense of the power that they put into the hands of the people to run the church. It's from a lot of other denominations. And the hope is that the congregation takes up that charge and involves themselves, right? So prayers for a smooth cooperative meeting and just prayers for the future of our spiritual community as we move along in 20. With that final prayer, the divine spirit hears our prayers.
Yes, you, fill us with your love, show us how to serve the neighbors we have from you. Kneels at the feet of his friend, silently washes their feet. Jesus, you acted as servant to them. Neighbors are rich and poor, varied in color and race. Neighbors are near to us and far away. Jesus, fill us with your love, show us how to serve the neighbors we have from you.
Meeting us in the midst of the world as it is, the divine invites us to follow, to live into the urgency of now, and to risk believing. The only thing we risk losing are the nets that entangle us. With the assurance of God's companionship, let us go as disciples of hope and justice and compassion. May it be so.